So heroes of the Old Testament, right? It's where we've been. We've been studying our way through the book of Judges, and you're definitely going to want a Bible open, okay? Because this story is complicated. I want to show you kind of verse by verse, walk you through this, and you might even underline a couple things, so grab a pen, or if you've got your digital Bible, you can highlight something here. And I'll just be honest with you, these stories are getting progressively harder to tell you. They're difficult to preach. You know why? Each judge gets worse. I mean, I can assure you that this week and next week, we have 2 weeks left here, right? Jephthah today, Samson next week. I can assure you that these stories are not going to be told in our preschool classes. Because these two judges, these two heroes, they're not good people. I mean, they are messy, and life is messy in the midst of this. And don't get me wrong, they're still judges. They're still preached about in the book of Hebrews as people who had faith that God was going to use them to do something great. But make note of this. There's a difference between a hero and a role model. Heroes step in at a moment of crisis and they save the day, but it doesn't make them a role model. A role model is someone you want to be like. Our hero today, he's definitely not a role model, and we'll finish up next week. With Samson, that guy's definitely not a role model, but they are heroes. And so we're going to take a look at their story. So turn to Judges chapter 10, find your way there. There is something, though, that I want us to realize, that we can still learn from someone who's a hero but not a role model, but we often learn from what they did in their life and go, I never want to do that. We're going to learn from their failures. And the truth is, most of us, we're probably never going to grow up to be heroes. All right? No one's going to have a costume with your name on it, all right? You're never going to grow up to save a nation. But listen to this. When we preach these stories, the truth is we can all be role models showing who Jesus is to our world so that they can cross from death to life. We need actually more role models than we need heroes. And we can all be that if you're a follower of Christ. So here we go. In Judges chapter 10, we run across this man by the name of Jephthah. Typically in a message, I would start with a story or a question or something to get you intrigued and say, hey, you need to be able to listen to this story and kind of tempt you to really lean in. To be honest with you, there is no fitting introduction to get you to listen to this story because this story is pretty horrific. It will stand on its own. Here's where we go. Like every story in the book of Judges, it begins by God being rejected by people. Chapter 10, verse 6. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. And then listen to this list. They also served the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. Did they leave anybody out? I mean, they looked at all their neighbors and like, we're going to pick their God and their God and their God and their God, and we're just going to adopt all of the beliefs and all of the practices of all of these other gods, which, just make note for a moment, included things like, temple prostitution and child sacrifice. How did you adopt that and incorporate that in with the God of the Old Testament? So God turns around and he gets angry with his people. And in verse 6 it says, and because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. It says he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. Listen to that language. Shattered and crushed the Israelites. For 18 years, they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan. 18 years, God's people lived in pain and suffering. And they finally had enough, and they cry out to God for help. But it's interesting because this is the only time in the book of Judges where God responds differently. Verse 11, the Lord replied. He's trying to answer their cry for help. And God goes through this list. He's like, have I not saved you? When the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, the Maonites oppressed you and you cried out for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods. Now listen to this. This is the first time he's ever said this. So I will no longer save you. Can you imagine God looking at his family? Just going, I'm done with you. I'll go find another family. This is God is just fed up. He even taunts his people. Verse 14, he says, go and cry out to the gods that you have chosen. Hey, if you serve those gods, why don't you ask them for help? That's essentially what he says. But God changes his mind. But only when the Israelites do something. Instead of just saying, God help us, they go to all these Ashtoreth poles and all these statues of these false gods, and they start tearing them down. And verse 16 reads this way: he could bear Israel's misery no longer. See, God didn't want his people just to be in pain and say, oh, God, help me. Or say, hey, God, we're in trouble. What God wanted was them to turn away from all this that they had accepted and created that was not from him, following these false gods, tear them down and return to God. And when they did, he's like, I can't tolerate my kids hurting. Parents, you get this, right? As disobedient and crazy as their kids have made their lives, there's moments where you just go, I just can't take their pain anymore. And I'm going to step in, I'm going to help. So the people of Gilead, this people of God, they devise a plan because their enemies, they're coming in to attack. Look at verse 18. The leaders of the people of Gilead said this to each other: whoever will take lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead. Just underline that word, head over all. That's what they're offering. Hey, listen, if you're going to step up and lead the army, here's what we'll do. You're going to be the ruler, you're going to be the boss. You're going to be the hero of the story, and all of Gilead will follow you. And this is where Jephthah comes in. Chapter 11, verse 1. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. You can see why he's being brought in at this point. His father was Gilead and his mother was a prostitute. Whoops. This is his family. This is his story. Verse 2, Gilead's wife, not the prostitute, but his wife, also bore him sons, and when they grew up, they drove Jephthah away, saying this: you're not going to get any inheritance in our family because you're the son of another woman. No, notice this, it wasn't necessarily about the woman being a prostitute that they rejected him for. They just turned around and said this: our father has some substantial means, and we're not sharing. You belong to that woman, that illegitimate woman, and you're an illegitimate birth. You have no standing in our family. So they drove him away. Jephthah, he has nothing. He has no family heritage. His mom has nothing. So what happens with people when they have nothing and family rejects them? Well, Jephthah's story, here's what he does. He becomes a gangbanger. It's in the text. Let me show you. Verse 3. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. He found other people who were like him. He said, we don't have anything, but we're going to be family for each other, and our family is pretty much going to be based off of violence. And so Jephthah, don't miss this, Jephthah, just like God, was rejected until his family needed help. Here's how the story goes. Look at verse 4. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead, where's he from? Gilead, right? The elders of Gilead went to Jephthah from the land of Tob, and they said, come, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. His brothers and part of his family possibly show up and say, these gileadites, they're afraid, right? They're going, hey, listen, we got these Ammonites who are coming in and they're going to battle against us. They're going to kill us. They're going to pressure us, shatter us, crush us even more. Who's the biggest thug we know? Jephthah. Somebody call Jephthah. So they go to him and they just said, hey, we need your help. Be our commander. That's what they invited him to do. Do you remember what I had you underline earlier? Head over all of us. Their plan was this: whoever's going to lead the army, they're going to be the boss, not just over the army, of all of Gilead. We'll give them everything. Notice what they offer him. Hey, Jephthah, would you come back? And I know we didn't treat you right, but hey, whatever, that's in the past, right? If you come back, we'll let you be the commander of the whole army. Do you see how they just degraded their offer to Jephthah? See, the truth is this. They don't actually want Jephthah. They just want his help. This is how God's people have been treating God for a long time. They didn't actually want God. They didn't want his ways. They didn't want his headship. They didn't want him in charge. They just wanted God's help. I don't know about you, but when I read that, I'm convicted. That there's moments in my own life, if I'm really, really honest, that I'm not sure I want God, his ways, his leadership, him being the boss of me, because I kind of sometimes want to be the boss of me. Don't you? I know you're staring back at me. You're like, don't nod, don't nod. The truth is, I think all of us, even as followers of Christ, there's moments where we reject God's leadership, and we don't want him necessarily, but sometimes we treat him like we just want his help. Verse 7, Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me? Drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" Why? Because this is what people do. People go when they're hurting and they're in trouble, they just go to whoever can help them, regardless of whether they're actually going to appreciate them in the end or not. Verse 8, the elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Now we want you. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." See, he didn't take their first offer. Now they sweeten the pot. Listen, you're not just going to be the commander of the army. We're going to actually let you lead the entire people of Gilead. Jephthah agrees to fight for him. They all gather in front of God, and they go over all the details of this, and they say it all again. Jephthah, if you win the battle, we're all going to follow you. But don't miss this. The Gileadites, they treat Jephthah just like they treated God. They went to Jephthah, and they went to God when they needed help, but they really didn't want either in their lives. What drove Jephthah to say yes? Maybe a longing to have a standing amongst people, his need to belong. But what drove God to say yes to helping him? It's this one quality about God that I think belongs to all of us who are followers of Jesus, or at least it should, and it's mercy. If you're taking notes, you'll see it in your notes there. A hero allows mercy to override his deficiencies and rejection in order to help those who may not truly appreciate them. This is why pastors quit, to be honest. Sometimes pastors quit because they sense that people don't really want me in their life. But when they get into crisis, they call. I mean, some of you get this, right? You deal with the reality that your friends never call you until they want their computer fixed. Come on. Your kids don't call you to have a talk. They call you because they ran out of money. Any guys drive trucks? Women drive trucks? Come on. The neighbor don't call you to invite you to dinner. They call you when they need your truck. Your spouse sometimes really sweet to you. Not because they want to connect, but because they have a honey-do list. Less people laughed, huh? I'm sitting next to my spouse. That never happens. The first thing that we have to deal with is just first our deficiencies. Listen, every person who longs to help and serve other people, there's sometimes we just feel deficient. In Jephthah's story, it was his history and where he came from. I wasn't born to the right family. I don't have support in my life. I'm not enough to help other people. You ever felt like that? I have. If it's not the deficiency, it's the rejection. Listen, people have rejected me. They don't really appreciate me. So if I step in and help, will they really want me, or do they just want my help? Jephthah, he's drawn in by this acceptance and this possibility of being welcomed back as a hero. But the thing that drives God is this. It's his mercy. Question. Is there a situation in your life right now, a person in your life right now, at work, in your neighborhood, in your family, in your church, sitting in this room right now, that needs your help? And you might sit there and go, I can't, I don't have what they need, I'm deficient. Or I won't because they don't appreciate me. They rejected me when I had needs. I will tell you, every single leader of God, every single mature Christian, at some point in their life, when you step out to serve and help and be a role model for people, you will go unappreciated because you didn't do it to be appreciated, did you? If we served because we wanted to be appreciated, that's actually an immaturity on our part. But if we're honest, isn't it hard to step back in when you're underappreciated and undervalued and you know you're being used and you wonder in the end, if I do step in to help them, they're not really going to appreciate me anyways. They really don't want me. They just want my help. If we treat God like that, don't we lean into his mercy and go, God, I know I've used you for your blessings. And I haven't always said, God, I want you so much that I actually want your ways in my life. And if we lean into his mercy, can't we show mercy to those around us too? Let's go back to Jephthah's story here. Most of chapter 11 is Jephthah haggling unsuccessfully with these enemies, these Ammonites, right? And at the end, the negotiations break down. You get to verse 29. Find that? Chapter 11, verse 29. It says this, then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. Negotiations didn't work. It's time to fight. Let's put the gloves on. Let's go. You know what's interesting about Jephthah's story? God is strangely quiet. In the earlier stories in the book of Judges, God keeps showing up in these battles and God keeps speaking into these people's lives. Here's what's interesting. In the whole story of Jephthah, in these 3 chapters, God speaks at the beginning of the story, and it's mostly words of anger. I'm just mad at you all. You've rejected me. And then God's Spirit comes on Jephthah in this moment, and God doesn't show up again. He's credited with the victory that Jephthah's about to win. Sorry to ruin the end of the story. They win the battle. But God is strangely quiet. His influence is strangely absent, which is going to lead to some pretty horrific moments. And Jephthah panics going into the battle. And this is where the story turns unbelievably ugly. Verse 30. And Jephthah, he made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's. And I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Seems like a weird vow. God gives Jephthah the victory. And look down at verse 34. This happens when he comes home. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and he cried, "Oh no, my daughter. You've brought me down and I'm devastated. I've made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." What? As a dad in that moment, is Jephthah right? I mean, he knows God, and he's like, listen, God wants me to be a man of my word. I told you I would offer whatever first thing that came out that door to meet me as a burnt offering. I'm just going to do it. I got to be a man of my word. That's what God wants, right? No, not for a moment. If you believe that, that's a total misinterpretation of these scriptures. Does God want him to break his vow? Yeah. 100%, you throw yourself on the mercy of God. God, I'm going to break my word to you. I know I gave you my word, but I'm going back on it because this is not what you intended. And if I break my vow and it costs me my life, may it cost me my life, not hers. There's no justice in this. Now, it's interesting because some scholars have tried to downplay the vow that he made because it was so horrific. And some of you are thinking like, this story is not in the Bible. There's no way God's going to intervene and God is going to step in and save the day, right? Some scholars have said this. Jephthah, he wasn't making a vow to sacrifice a human. He was actually saying that if an animal walks out of the house, then he's going to offer that as a burnt offering. But if it's a person, he will commit that servant who's going to come and greet him out of the house. He's going to commit that servant to go to the temple and serve for the rest of their life. Serve God. That person will be unto the Lord. But I think this story's so ugly that some scholars have tried to really soft-step it to make it a little more palatable. But when he says, whoever comes out of the house or whatever comes out of the house, it could be termed either way, to greet me, most scholars believe he's referring to a person. And some would say this, well, he's saying, listen, it can be either a burnt offering or an offering to the temple, like you could bring that person to the temple, like it's not a sacrifice, they're going to serve him for the rest of their life. And yet the Hebrew is pretty clear. He's intending that it's a burnt offering, it's a death sacrifice. It's a horrible story. I told you, this is hard to preach. Other scholars have tried to say, Jephthah, he just made a foolish vow out of desperation because he was afraid. Answer this question with me. Why did Jephthah make a vow to God to sacrifice a person? It wasn't because he was foolish. Here's why he did it. He had adopted all of the pagan beliefs that were around him. Do you remember the long list? They followed the god of the Amorites, all those other ites. And amongst those beliefs, of these other pagan beliefs, was that you could sacrifice a person to God, to appease God. Jephthah wasn't being foolish, he was being pagan. Jephthah had contaminated all of these practices of the Canaanite gods, and he contaminated the beliefs and the practices of what it meant to follow the one true God. I know we read this and we think, I can't even imagine the horror of Jephthah killing his own daughter. Let me put this in context a little bit. It's easy for us to stand in judgment over Jephthah because he had personally contaminated what it meant to follow this God who loves them with these horrible pagan practices. But I'm going to say this, and I want you to please hear me out. But what if Jephthah was looking on us today and wondering, how could 500,000 babies be aborted today in the United States? And that be okay with us? Now, please pause for a moment because of this. I know that we are on dangerous ground and people's emotions are at stake, so I don't want you to miss what I'm about to say. I rarely ever talk about this. But in the last 30 years of ministry, when people show up to my office in tears going, I have carried this weight with me for so long. I've heard too many stories from women and men alike who carry the weight of regret and the grief of a decision they made a long time ago to end a pregnancy and end a life. And they still carry it today. I've heard women tell me, yeah, I made that decision and regretted it. And then when I was older and I had a baby, all of that traumatization came back to me. And I've never forgiven myself. I've never found a way to stop the nightmares. It sits with me. And I've heard men say the same thing. Yeah, I told my girlfriend she needs to take care of that. And the weight that they carry and the grief that they carry. Now, here's why I tell you this. I am not coming at you today. In the best of my ability, I'm trying to come alongside you. If I came at you, that would be a condemnation. I'm not. I'm trying to come alongside you to say, I believe that God can heal from that, restore from that, bring you peace and hope and life again. Because the reality is, I'm not talking about people out there, I'm talking about people in here. My second reason for bringing this up is, granted, this is kind of the example of Jephthah took a life, and we take life when it comes to abortion. And if you don't agree with me, I'll just reason with you one thing, and I'm not here to create an argument. Just say this, like, if the Mars rover landed on Mars and detected a heartbeat, the headlines of every paper would read the same: life found on Mars. But because it's not on Mars, because it's in here, and people are terrified of what that means, whether it be shame in your family or whether it be, I can't do this, I can't afford this, and people make bad decisions based off of that. We can't have it both ways. It is a double standard. I want people to find healing and hope again. My second reason is I realize this, that we do this in many different ways. What I mean by that is we contaminate what it means to follow Jesus with all kind of godless culture. And if we're just really honest, I mean, how we deal with money. Do we really go to God's word and go, okay, God, whatever it says about how I'm supposed to deal with money, I'm in? What about honesty? Okay, God, I'm going to tell the truth no matter what it costs me. What about marriage? God, I'm going to build the kind of marriage that you want in here. And I will just tell you the primary feature of marriage, the primary quality of marriage is sacrifice. Do we build our marriages that way? In our culture, I mean, as long as I'm, maybe offending anybody, I'm just going to go for the whole thing. Like, do we really build our beliefs about sex and sexuality off of God's word? Like, God, whatever you say, I'm going for it. I'm going to believe it. I'm going to not just believe it in my head. I'm going to put it into practice, even if the rest of the world thinks I'm crazy. I just don't think we do. Point number 2 is this: a hero protects the purity of following God and does not allow it to be contaminated by a godless culture. Now, please don't miss what I'm not saying. There is hope and life and forgiveness and restoration and a release of regret if you will bring your brokenness and sin to God and say, God, I want that great exchange. I will give you my brokenness and sin. You give me forgiveness and relationship. I'm all in. So if anybody leaves feeling condemned today, you've not heard me. Do we allow the Bible to be our authority for truth and practice, even if it's not culturally acceptable? So, question, how did Jephthah's situation turn out? His daughter makes a statement in verse 36. Here's what she says. My father, she replied, you have given your word to the Lord, do to me just as you have promised. What? Now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites, but grant me this one request. She said, give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry. Jephthah says, you may go. You let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After 2 months, she returned to her father. And this line just kills me. And he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. Now, some scholars have tried to say, listen, the reason it says she was a virgin is because she was going to go to the temple and forever serve there and never marry, right? And one of the biggest, maybe the biggest value in this culture is that you would marry and have a family, right? This is Abraham's story. Remember, they couldn't have any kids. It was like this devastating thing. Your value, who you were, I mean, they're grieving not that she was a virgin, but that she would never have a husband and never have kids. It wasn't about that she was going to the temple. It was about her life being over. Most scholars believe this, that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter, which is a horrible story of Jephthah's failure. But question, where did his failure come from? This one thing. Remember, the Spirit of God came on him. He's going into battle, and he pauses and makes this vow. Why? He didn't trust in God's power and his goodness. If you look at point number 3, a hero doesn't bargain with God, but rather optimistically trusts in God's goodness and power. Do you remember how this began? I mean, Jephthah, he selfishly tries to secure his safety and his future by bargaining with his enemies. First, he bargains with the Gileadites. Remember that? He haggles with them. He's like, hey, I'll come in. I'll be your leader. Once I defeat him, though, I'm the leader of everyone. He haggled with the Gileadites for power. He then unsuccessfully haggled with the Ammonites for peace. And then he tragically haggles with God for his future. And the only reason he haggled with God is because he didn't trust him. Let me end with this. In the book of Mark, chapter 9, there's a dad, and he brings his son to Jesus and says, can you help me? His son couldn't speak, and he would have these seizures, fall on the ground. And it was stated that he had an impure spirit in him, some kind of evil spirit inside of him. And the dad literally, he speaks these words to Jesus. If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus replies like this. I love it. He goes, if you can? As if to say, you know who you're talking to? If you can. And then Jesus makes this wonderful statement. Everything is possible for one who believes. Everything is possible. I love the fact that he doesn't say everything will absolutely always be done for the person who believes, because that's the health and wealth gospel, and that's garbage. He says everything is possible for one who believes. And then the dad responds with this statement. I do believe. Here's my boy. I do believe you can do this. And then he says, would you help me overcome my unbelief? Oh, I love how raw it is. He's not faking like he's got it all together or that his beliefs are so great. And I just wonder, is there a situation that you are facing today that is overwhelming? That you and I together might pray this. God, I believe that everything is possible for the person who believes. And God, I do believe. But would you help me overcome my unbelief? Isn't that a great prayer? It's in your notes. Take that home. And maybe pray that this week and say, God, in what situation should I pray this? Very last thing. I know there's 4 points. I gave you 3. Here's the 4th point. It's the gospel according to Jephthah. I know it's a weird statement because where's the gospel in this? I think the gospel according to Jephthah actually gives us hope. So let me be clear about a few things as we wrap this up. The only child that God ever wanted sacrificed in order to win a victory was his own son. I know I asked you, could you imagine if you were Jephthah? Could you imagine what it was like to lose a child? God can. I don't mean lose a child like the child died and you were surprised. I mean, the child died and it was actually a part of your doing and your planning. That's the gospel. That our world was so lost and so broken in sin that God said the only way is for me to step in and I'm going to sacrifice my boy on a cross. And this exchange is going to take place. If you bring me your sin and your repentance, I will give you forgiveness. I will take your regret and we will live in relationship where I'm not just commander of the army. I'm actually your boss and your leader. In the Bible, it's called the Lordship of God. That's the gospel, and that's the good news. If God can step into Jephthah's world and rescue and save in that moment, and I know I got big questions. Why didn't God step in at the end of that story? I don't know. But if God can use a guy like Jephthah, and later on in Hebrews call him a hero, maybe God could use scoundrels like us to make a difference in someone else's life. God is not looking for perfection. He's not looking to disqualify you from a past decision to say, I'll never use you today. Because the truth is, we don't really need heroes as much as we need role models. And role models are this. They're not perfect people. They're just people who live authentically in relationship with God and say, I'm trying as best I can. I understand these scriptures, and I'm allowing God, the Lord of my life, to guide me through these scriptures to set the precedence of my life and the practices and how I know him and how I follow him. We need those kind of role models who will put this above any kind of godless culture in our world, even if people will shame you for it. And trust me, they'll shame you for it. I think the gospel, according to Jephthah, gives us hope. If God could use him, he could use us. And he offered his son's life on a cross so that we could be forgiven. God, would you today bring hope in this room so that we would live as role models? And God, would you somehow, for the regrets and the pains that we have because of our decisions in the past, would you bring hope and healing and new life to all of us? Yes? If so, let's bow our heads and ask God for that. I don't know what your prayer looks like today, but whatever he asks you to pray, would you just respond to him out of your gut? Lord, I pray for those in this room right now. That I know that I may have touched on something that was painful for somebody. And I pray that as that surfaces, it surfaces enough for you to touch it and heal it. That there'd be hope and life on the other side of regret. And God, I pray for those right now that they've served and they've tried to be a role model and they feel unappreciated. That God, that they would not give up living for you and being an example for others. Lord, I still got lots of questions about that crazy story because it makes me uncomfortable. But the truth is, God, you offered your son's life, and that's what I trust and believe in. So, Lord, give us the courage to not just call you when we need you, but to make you the Lord of our lives. And if you want that, would you say amen?